Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night. Again, avoiding being a time zonist. And today I want to talk a little bit about what some people have come to call better off blue, but more broadly, the idea of normies as sort of gatekeepers of knowledge and what potential risks of that are and why it might be damaging and why it might not be. I touched upon this briefly in a recent video where I talked about this idea that there might be some things that people just can't handle overall. But let's first talk about really what is a normie. I've talked about this before, but when I'm talking about normies, I'm talking about sort of so-called neurotypical people, but also people who stick within a certain narrative they've been fed their entire lives and don't really think about things beyond that. And this goes for politics, culture, science, whatever it might be. Topics that may or may not be true necessarily, but topics that go outside of that bubble, that are viewed as potentially dangerous, taboo, forbidden, whatever. And I remember not too long ago, I had a brief discussion with a baron of Brooklyn about this idea that smart people can't really be normies. And I kind of disagree with that. Of course, there's a difference between somebody who is of average intelligence or below average, who simply cannot grasp some of the things that are beyond his ken, and therefore sticks to his bubble. But then again, there's a difference between someone who can grasp these things, and this is kind of my point, who's aware of certain things, but nonetheless insists there should be a taboo about talking about these things, and that it should remain hush-hush for the foreseeable future. And I think those people, too, effectively count as normies, because they are guardians of normalcy, of the sacred, of what's considered decent, right? And even though they're smart enough to grasp certain things. So, for example, I know of a behavioral geneticist called Catherine Page Harden, who is a dyed-in-the-wool leftist, very far left progressive politics, who spent an entire book writing not about her research or her findings or trying to illuminate the public on behavioral genetics, but rather just as a political polemic, right? That's the kind of person who is, obviously hyper-intelligent, hyper-aware, for example, of the ultimate impact and importance of genes, but refuses to communicate that to the world. Although technically she has run into some trouble with people on the left who are trying to undermine her work because she even dares to get involved in genetics and behavioral genetics. But nonetheless, she doesn't want to talk about the potential ramifications and risks associated with discovering certain things in her line of work. I too would regard that as a very normie position. So sure, there are people who are just, frankly speaking, too dumb to get certain things, but there's no shortage of people who are quite smart, who understand these things as well, but at the same time more than willing to suppress knowledge and make sure that no discussions are had in any public or even not so public space about it. So I think in some sense, a much better criterion for determining whether or not a person is a normie or they're operating within the bounds of normiedom is a question of whether or not they're affected by something. Because usually, as I've pointed out in the past, it's failure or things not working out that points you in a certain direction and leads you to want to understand certain things. If things are always going well, then you don't really have a problem. So for example, in the dysfunctional states of America, for people who live in nice neighborhoods with very low crime or no crime, and they live in, for example, particularly blue states, then it's a bizarre notion to them that firearms might be an important safety measure, even though that's manifestly true given the right environment and circumstances, but of course they can't relate because it never really occurred to them, so they have a particular opinion about these things. So very often, people lose their quote-unquote normie virginity because they discover things about the world that have turned out to be manifestly not true, and it's at that stage where it really becomes debatable whether or not the whole better off blue concept is actually a good thing. I think it really comes down to how damaging certain things in your life have been, how much it's affected you, how much it's turned your life upside down. And if things haven't been absolutely terrible, then maybe some of these truths don't really matter. In fact, you get a lot of spectators, I've noticed, on Manosphere channels who have no connection to any of this whatsoever. Married people, married men, even married women, and women in general, who really can't relate to a lot of the issues, problems, etc., that are discussed in the Manosphere, and yet they might have some vague inkling of it, even if it doesn't affect them directly. But of course, part of that is boredom, part of that's curiosity. But there's no real reason why individuals like that need to take a really deep dive into all the pills because they're just not affected by it. So, in some sense, all these pills or pillification, it's all on a need-to-know basis. Are you at a stage in your life where things absolutely require this clarification, this edification? I can tell you from my own experience, as an old man, that I had my share of experience with women, largely unsuccessful relationships, but I had them. But the behaviors I observed, not just in the relationships, but in relationships other people had, as well as media and just observing human beings in general, these questions became effectively irrepressible in my mind. I had to ask them and figure out what was going on. And the big moment of click for me, as many of you probably know if you've been with me for a while, was discovering various people like the late, great Barbarossa. I thought, wow, all these observations I'm making, I'm not the only one who's crazy about the world, about women and men, about how these things work. So, although I had some experiences, they weren't amazing experiences. So there was the negative aspect, and I think ultimately that's what drives people to seek out this information. In some cases, to improve things, my conclusion, as you might suspect, because I'm ever the optimist, as all of you know, I'm the greatest optimist on YouTube, that I don't really think much can be done about the situation for most people, specifically most men. I don't think gender relations are probably ever going to return to what they were. And even then, I have grave doubts that they were particularly good to begin with. Another thing that a lot of people like to argue about, how back in the day, men and women got along better. And I'm very iffy about that. So, in some sense, it was knowledge, you could say, for nothing because, well, I don't think anything's going to result from it, and I don't think very much is going to improve as a result of it. But from another perspective, I'd say, given my own inclinations and proclivities, it probably was an inevitability, which is to say, I ask questions about the world, I'm reasonably inquisitive. At some point in time, I would have asked these questions regardless, and so whether or not it makes me happy or content to learn, one could say, the underlying truth of, say, intersex relations, it doesn't really matter at the end because I was just going to end up in that position regardless. But this doesn't just apply to this, of course. It applies to a million things. And my issue to some degree with the smarter versions of normies, these gatekeepers of knowledge, is that a lot of these people could be applying their knowledge in the public space in an effort to improve things or an effort to move things in a direction that would be helpful to everyone, where we talked about certain things, and by opening up certain discussions on taboo topics, we could possibly find solutions. Now, a lot of the reluctance these days, one has to admit this, comes from the incredibly charged political atmosphere we all live in, where everyone and his mother is afraid of saying boo for reasons that should be pretty obvious. It's things like cancel culture. Imagine if you're a researcher, and it's your intelligence researcher, right? And you are of the view that intelligence is a highly heritable trait. Well, you might recognize that, and maybe that's what your research is telling you, but are you going to go outside and broadcast that to the world? Probably not, because that would have negative consequences for you. And if you're a behavioral geneticist, like this woman, Catherine Page Harden, is, you are also not going to broadcast these things. In fact, you're going to put up a smokescreen and prevent people from openly discussing this stuff. And of course, you can understand why these people do that. It makes sense. And there is a final issue, of course, and that's perhaps, in some ways, one of the most difficult things. The unrelatability that emerges when you transform from a normie to a non-normie, or you just have never been a normie. The lack of desire to discuss sports and the weather, or in other words, the lack of desire to participate in the conspiracy of silence, as it were. That's really difficult because it becomes difficult to interact with people, to relate to them. And even if they're aware of these things, they're much more likely to dismiss them outright because, again, if they're still hovering within normie status, they're not going to want to have open discussions about that. And if you're anything like me, you'll find that standard discussions become, well, less and less stimulating. They're just not as interesting as they used to be. And as a consequence, you will be inclined to want to associate with other people. But the problem is the world is filled with normies, and therefore, what do you really do? In the final analysis, I wouldn't say that better off blue is axiomatically true or not. It really depends on how badly you need to know these things and how much you're being driven in that direction. For some people, it's inevitable. For other people, it is needs driven. And for other people, it's just not necessary because they haven't really run up against any potholes in the road, so to speak. And I think ultimately that's what separates people, right? If things work for people, they will stay normies. If they don't work for people, they're less likely to stay that because they're going to be, in all likelihood, looking for solutions. Even if there aren't solutions, they're going to be looking to understand what the underlying cause is behind these things. And that is really what divides us. And it can be indeed a very lonely world, not being able to relate to people. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like button, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon to be informed of my videos. That seems to be a vain course of action, but nonetheless, try to do so. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. You take care. May the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.